I'm going to record it on this computer because that'll make it easy for me to get to send request. Oh, apparently I have to ask you, Julie, to record on my computer.
Okay, we should be live.
All right, super. Well, good evening and welcome to the 802 United. It's been a while. We've kind of been a little bit busy with, elections and then, the legislature. So we haven't had a town hall in a while. But what we love to do is bring to you, our audience, and the people that follow us on YouTube and TikTok and Facebook and are part of this movement for people to become educated about our Kansas legislature and the topics that affect all of our lives. We love to bring you presentations like this so that you can learn right along with us. Admittedly, so not an expert on tax policy here. I am here to learn. And I wanted to begin by just saying how the 802 United got started. What the heck are we? We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, and we are all about education. And we got started, why it's called 802 was because we got started with the Vote No movement on August 2nd of 2022. So now everybody brace yourselves and get ready for August 4th, 2026 for Vote No 2.0, but that's a topic for another day. I just wanted to read for you our mission statement, what the 802 is all about. We value the people and opportunities available in Kansas. We strive to make our state a welcoming environment for all humans, utilizing principles that put community and purposeful kindness ahead of ideological extremism. That's what we're here for, folks. Michael, actually, Julie is our board president. Michael is also an officer on the board of the 802. And we've asked Michael to host tonight because he has a special place in his heart for tax policy. So take it away, Michael.
Oh, I'm sure Chris Courtwright and I could while away the hours of many a lost cause of tax policy. But thank you very much for that, Betsy, and thank you, Representative Sawyer Clayton, for joining us, and Chris Courtwright. We've known each other for a while and had many a conversation about public sector policy and economics. But wanted to start with, how did we get into this boat? Because this conversation actually goes way back to, most people don't realize what the old model for um, supporting property taxes was for the state, how that impacted municipalities in making their budgets, how they were relying on property taxes. What was that model that we used to have?
I guess I would say, Mike, in response to your question, the model we used to have was more of a partnership. When I started working for my own video is freezing up. Are you guys hearing me okay?
Yes.
You're pretty quiet, but we can hear you and we can see you.
Okay. When I started working for the legislature in the 1980s, there was a lot more lawmakers who had a background in having served in local government than we have now. There was a lot more former county commissioners, former city councils, former school board people than some of the folks who've been showing up here more recently, straight out of the private sector in a lot of cases. And part of that partnership, the legislature realized that the public does not like property taxes, right? And property taxes are the bread and butter of local finance. Locals can levy sales taxes to help lower their property taxes, but locals don't have any income tax authority, and locals get the lion's share of their money, the vast majority of it, from property taxes. So there's always been this partnership. Hey, what can we at the state, or there had been for many decades, what could we as the state do to help locals out and diminish some of the angst of the public overpaying their property taxes? There was a pool of money that the lawmakers allowed local units to have from the 1930s all the way through 2002. Revenue sharing money, local ad valorem tax reduction fund money that earmarked to hold down property tax levies. So there were a number of those things that the legislature did to acknowledge that. Also, one of the things the legislature did in the early 1970s under Governor Docking, Kansas put in at that time the first so-called property tax circuit breaker relief program. And what those kinds of programs are aimed at is they are aimed at giving people direct property tax relief out of the state general fund, really as an income tax credit, but not narrowing the property tax base. Okay, in other words, if you're above age 55, fixed income senior, someone in the household is blind or otherwise disabled, and your income is below a certain level, we acknowledge that you're trying to pay your prescription drugs and you're maybe on a fixed income. So property taxes going up can be a heck of a burden. So we're going to give you back X amount of money based on your circumstances with the circuit breaker program. And the reason it's set up the way it is to prevent shifting the tax burden onto other taxpayers. If we do like some states did and just say, hey, if you're above age 55, you don't have to pay any property taxes. And that just simply shifts the burden onto other classes of property. One more thing I'll say, and then I'll pipe down. The one thing I always tell any audience, it doesn't matter if it's a high school class or who I'm talking to about property taxes, the one thing you should always remember is property taxes are like a balloon, okay? Like a balloon you would have at a child's birthday party. And if you squeeze one side of that balloon, what's going to happen to the other side? The other side is going to get bigger, right? And the tax burden shifts. Okay, and so if we're going to exempt seniors' property taxes and we're not careful how we do it, we're going to raise the taxes on 28-year-olds who we're trying to keep in the state in the first place. So the bottom line is the property tax burden has gone up for a number of reasons in the state. One very recent reason is the damn pandemic and the extent to which residential values have risen in the last 5 years certainly is part of it. But the legislature taking property off the tax rolls over the years and over the decades is another thing that has narrowed the base and squeezed the balloon. If you're the smallest local government out there, let's make it really simple. If you're a cemetery district, you're going to meet once a year and set your budget in the summer. And you got to pay, as a cemetery district, you got to pay some guy to put gas in his mower and mow the lawn at the cemetery. And every year you have your ceremonial meeting and you meet once a year to set your budget of $20,000 or whatever you got to pay this guy to mow the lawn and put gas in his mower. Okay. And you do that every year and you're some small rural cemetery district. Well, $20,000 is $20,000. That's what it takes for the guy to put gas in his mower. And when you reconvene one summer, you don't give a damn if the legislature took business machinery and equipment off the tax rolls the previous year, okay? You still got to get that $20,000. So your $20,000 is certified to the county clerk, to the county treasurer, to the county appraiser in the fall before the mill levies are set. And if you'd levied 2 mills the year before to get that $20,000, you might be levying 2.4 mills this year because the tax base was narrowed. Okay, that's the way this works, and so that's the example of the balloon being squeezed and the burden shifting onto everybody else.
Well, and go ahead, Betsy.
So, like I say, not a tax person. Tell you all about high risk OB, but I don't know tax. What's a mill? What does 2 versus 2.5 mil mean?
A mill is a tenth of a penny. Okay, It is a tenth of a cent, and locals, their budgets are converted into mills. When the county clerk and treasurer and appraiser sit down in the fall and take all the budgets adopted from school districts and cities and counties and townships and cemetery districts and everybody else, they take the assessed value of your property, okay, not the appraised value, but the assessed value, and they divide it by the total assessed value in the taxing subdivision, and they convert that to to how many mills it's going to take for them to raise their $20,000. Okay, in my example, that's a common misperception that locals deal with mills in their budgets. They have estimates, but I used to serve on a city council. I will tell you, there's never been a local unit in the history of this state, and property taxes have been levied since the 1860s. There's never been a one of them who's actually themselves set a mill levy. It's a procedural step that happens at the county clerk level. Okay, locals adopt a budget. They adopt dollars. And don't let Dave Trabert or anybody else tell you different. I've been there.
Well, and so, Chris, as you and I have talked about many times, this level of detail and understanding is a profession, and it's a profession for a reason. But also, as you noted, that profession and that experience has steadily slipped away from the people that are coming into the legislature and doing the work in the legislature. So, Representative Sawyer Clayton, what is it like to be in the legislature right now trying to have these conversations when some of that detail and experience is missing now?
Well, it might be, it's basically as you would expect. But one of the things that I do want to bring up, and I was talking with Chris about this earlier, I often hear from folks who, I'll say, oh, yeah, I'm on the tax committee. It's one of the most important ones that I serve on. And they'll say, oh, gosh, you must be really good with numbers. No, I'm not. I'm sure someone could dig up my algebra teacher to find out, and, have them say why. But here's the thing is that a lot of tax policy does have to do with numbers, calculations, and so on. But for the most part, and I know that a lot of folks who are especially data driven are not going to like to hear this, most tax policy is built on emotions and interpretations of how the taxpayer feels. So we've heard the phrase perception is reality. And that is very much the case here. Anyone who's ever knocked a door, let alone a number of doors. In fact, the last time I did a Zoom with Betsy, it was for a different organization, and I had to stop in my car, get good signal, and do the Facebook Live from when I was knocking doors. But when you talk to people at their doorsteps, you do hear them saying, especially up here in Johnson County, particularly in Northeast Johnson County, they have, and rightfully so, sticker shock when it comes to their property taxes going up. The reality of it is that people are looking at their household monthly budgets and trying to figure out what stays and what goes, and everyone needs to have a place to live, right? And so it really does, I hate to use this pun, but it gets people right where they live when they see that increase, and then they get upset, understandably so. And as much as we want to tell everyone about all of the nuances that surround these things, for the most part, the last thing that anyone needs or wants at their door is some egghead politician telling them, well, this is how your local services are funded, and don't you like these? People are well aware of that, but the reality is, or at least the reality for most politicians, is that all of us across the state, doesn't matter where we're from, we are getting lit up by our constituents about property taxes. And some of it, we don't know if people are sort of fanning the fire by, getting them angry about these particular taxes. So that might be some of it. But honestly, if you look at the reality, we do have a housing shortage, and supply and demand for housing is very high in my legislative district. And so guess what? Our valuations are jumping, and that is going to have an effect on our taxes. So again, a long-winded way for me for explaining that above all, the legislators in there, or at least the ones in the House, I can't speak for the Senate Tax Committee, but we are, and because we are up for election every 2 years, and so we are running, or at least the good ones are running by what we hear from our constituents, because that is our job, not what is politically expedient, not what we need to do to get reelected, but our job is to represent our constituents and to do our best to do their bidding when it comes to tax without blowing out the budget. So it's a delicate balancing act. We're constitutionally bound to balance the budget. And we should be, putting forth intelligent, responsible tax policy. But above all, we need to make sure that we are making our constituents feel represented, listened to, and respected. And so a lot of us are going to follow through with our voting records that way.
It's
Taking
funny
off of it. Oh, go
because,
ahead, Betsy. Sorry.
sorry, you say that people get that their property taxes pay for their local services, but Michael and I were saying before we went live here, if you take away state funding that would otherwise support these local services and because you want to lower your property taxes, the money for those services has to come from somewhere. And wait till you're on hold for an hour on 911. Then you will realize what your property taxes were paying for. But I do not think people get that 1 and 1 equals 2.
To a certain degree. I really do believe that because, again, I've had the privilege of representing my legislative district. I'm in my 13th year of representing them. And I have heard from in the darkest days of the Brownback era, when our budget was very much in the red, when we were having to do what we call rescission bills, and that is when the legislature has to vote to basically bring back some of those funds in order to make sure we're balancing in other areas. The governor can do what is called allotments, which are cuts that the governor is allowed to do, but sometimes the legislature has to do rescission. But in any case, when I have heard from some of my most conservative constituents back in those days, it's a strange thing to hear, but I have heard, please raise my income taxes. This doesn't make sense. I've never heard them tell me to raise their sales or property taxes, though. And that is something that I doubt that I will ever hear. And part of the reason is, of course, is that sales and property taxes, the higher those are, the more regressive they seem to be. And the reason is that we all have to live somewhere. We all have to eat. Even my dog, Olive, who loves these, she has to eat too. So that's right. But in any case, sorry about that. But in any case, so if we look at that and we hear again what our constituents are the most vocal about, it tends to be those two types of taxes. And so that is where, at least at the state level, you are going to see us trying to look for cuts because, again, you can say to your constituents, okay, look, we are in a budgetary situation. This is difficult. But for the most part, they expect to be heard, understood, and respected, and they want us to keep our promises. And so, again, it's a balancing act. We're not walking a tightrope, we're walking a razor wire up there, but it can be done. Although, as we go on in this hour, we'll find that sometimes good intentions end up with really bad legislation.
Well, and speaking of that, and Chris and I have talked about it many times, there's so many facets to this. If you say, oh, we want to fix property taxes, well, that impacts multiple areas of the budget. It impacts multiple areas of legislation. No one committee can make those decisions by itself. When you're looking at a complex problem like this, and we're facing a session that many right now have noted is one of the fastest sessions Kansas has seen in a while. Is it possible to put together the legislation when you're walking that razor thin line to have a long-term solution be put in place to start to address these problems? Or are you looking at situations where you end up feeling like you're putting a Band-Aid on it till you can maybe get to it next year?
Unfortunately, I think that really is often the case. And you also think about a balancing act, right? Because at least in the House, you have a very large contingent of legislators on one side of the aisle. You've got members from the minority party, which is where I'm from. And so you've got all these Republicans and all of these Democrats that are hearing the same thing. It's kind of like, again, in math class, you know how your teacher writes out the problem? And you might come up with different ways to solve it, but your teacher wants you to solve it a certain way. Well, you look at it this way, you have a lot of, you have a lot of very intelligent people working together who genuinely want to solve problems. But then, especially when it comes to property tax, there's really only so much that the state deals with. Then you have people that are asking for the state to put controls on local property taxing entities, of which there are many. And that's when we run into problems because The state is, we are all duly elected, but guess what? My county commissioner is also elected, has to earn her election. My chair of county commission, he has to earn it. All of my city council members, the mayors, the school board members, and everyone else with various taxing entities all are duly elected folks that are also accountable to the people. So then you get the issue of people telling state legislators, hey, we need you to put controls on these. And then you end up with the double pushback of locally elected officials who are not pleased with the state legislators. So you have to find a way to get that relief to the people and make them happy without alienating all of the other locally elected officials that serve here at home. And you
So
can
to
see
that
where you
point,
run into problems.
and Chris, one of the things that came up this cycle was the idea of putting a cap on increases in evaluations, on increases in property. Do these caps work if you're
No,
looking at a situation for what they are doing to local municipalities?
generally they don't. To underline the point Stephanie was making, the Kansas property tax system is very complicated. It's very Byzantine. It's not easily addressed in the hustle and bustle of a single legislative session. And in 1991, I'm sure the number has changed, but there was a big study. At that point in time, there were 4,025 property tax levying subdivisions in the state of Kansas. There, of course, were 105 counties, some 619 cities, 1,400 townships. In that era, there were more than 300 school districts. You added them all up, you got to a number north of 4,000. Okay, I think it's probably closer to 3,800 now. But it's a terrifying, crazy quilt of intersecting and overlapping jurisdictions. And so it's one size fits all is clearly not going to work. The valuation cap thing is a very simplistic approach that has been championed coming out of the Senate the last 4 or 5 years, because the Senate, some of them are, they're specializing in grievance politics. They're going to try, they know what upsets people. Property taxes upset people, but especially, and Stephanie knows this, one of the things that always upsets people is Kansas law since the 1860s has said January 1st is tax day. Whatever the county appraiser thinks your house is worth on January 1st, based on how much the value might have changed since the last year and what sales of similar property in your neighborhood was over the last year, and all these different approaches to value, on January 1st, that's tax day. And by sometime in usually March, valuation notices go out to the public. Okay, we send out the county appraisers send out valuation notices, and you get them in the mail, and people, wow, my value went up 12 or 15% above last year. Holy cow! And that starts your ability to appeal and fight your valuation process, right? You can go in and show the county appraiser pictures of water damage in your basement, or hey, I had hail damage to my roof. I didn't get it replaced. If I tried to sell this house, there's a $15,000 hit right here. And so that works. But the public is nevertheless irritated when they see the values go up. If your value is going up 12 or 15% and everybody else's value in your neighborhood is going up 12 or 15%, you're probably not going to see any increase in property taxes levied by your local units of government. Okay. That's just the way it works. But this capping of values approach, it's been criticized as being very poorly targeted, by the way, by the Right of Center Tax Foundation. They said, this is dumb, don't do this. This is what California did with Prop 13 in the late 70s. If you cap values, what's going to happen, if I'm living in an area where values are going up 10, 12, 15% a year, and we pass a constitutional amendment that says, notwithstanding that, your value can never go up 4% a year. Well, again, we got to pay the guy to mow the lawn. So what's going to happen to the mill levies to get the same amount of dollars if we artificially suppress valuation growth? Okay, mill levies are going to shoot up. All right, I'm not guaranteed any necessary benefit, although there's equity issues that come into play, because you're going to have a lot of property in the area of the state where Stephanie and I live that after a few years is not taxed at anywhere close to fair market value. But you're going to have some poor schlubs living out in central Kansas where their values may not be going up 4% or much higher than 4%, and they're going to be taxed at a lot closer to full fair market value after a few years. So there's some equity issues that come in.
Well, and Chris, I want to take a note from that comment too about equity issues and that you've raised before with some of the carve outs that have happened. And Stephanie, if you can speak to how has constituents reacted to the ongoing little almost pet projects where we're going to give this business a carve out, we're going to give this group of people a carve out, we're going to give these people a break. Where apparently, if you can get to the right person, if you can get the right legislation, and if you can have the right conversation, you can make sure your property taxes get addressed, even if the rest of the people are left holding the bag.
Chris, is this you or me? All right. So this is what I hear from my constituents for the most part. They are not overly irritated with some of the economic development incentive related carve outs, right? Because, by and large, they sort of see that as helping to develop Johnson County's local economy. I will say this, though, is that we did pass a property tax bill, which I supported, although I was not in love with an amendment that went on in committee. And I can't remember the initial bill number, and we'll talk about a little bit about how difficult it is to track things. But when it did pass, it was SB 35 or Senate Bill 35, and that removes a little bit of mills, but also part of the problem is that it ends up giving really minimal property tax relief to homeowners. And I know I've seen some folks from other parts of the state say, oh gosh, well, $500,000 houses. Well, guess what? Some of the homes that I represent are significantly more than $500,000. But even those, they get about like 88 dollars in property tax relief a year, which is a drop in the bucket. And you start getting to lower housing values, and where you're about the average house, I think they're getting around $48-50 a year. So, and a lot of that is because you have entities that have a lot more lobbying power, which are usually corporations and commercial and industrial properties that are going for those reductions, and so they're getting their piece as well. And so that's where you see all of this tax reduction, but it's not going to your average folks, and that's where we start running into major issues.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And then just to circle back to the constitutional amendment that, to Stephanie's credit, the House opted to not put on the ballot, even though the Senate is trying to horse it onto the ballot and has been for several years. It would have reduced angst. Legislators don't like getting screamed at Saturday morning town halls. Okay, to the extent Stephanie, to her credit, is at every town hall that's ever occurred in her district. She's great about that. Not everyone does that anymore. But over the years, more legislators in years past would hold town halls all across the state. After these valuation notices go out in March and April, legislators don't like getting yelled at about valuation notices. So they're always hypersensitive. So they think if we can suppress that, if Joe Sixpack only has his value go up 4% a year, he's not going to yell at me in late March when I'm doing my town hall. And even though in November, when he gets his tax bill, it won't really have changed because we just artificially shuffled things around. I don't want to be yelled at anymore. So that was one kind of parochial, self-serving motive for the suppression of valuation cap. Now, what I just said only applies to the local levies. Had we capped valuation growth, there would in fact have been a property tax reduction, but a huge budgetary problem for the state to the extent of the 20 mils, the fixed levy that's set by the state that goes to provide the first layer of funding for our public school system. Okay, had that gone on the ballot and had the public approved it, we would have lost north of $900 million in the state school finance formula, basically what used to be called local effort over the next 5 years. Okay, if you think we're going to adhere to previous mandates of the courts, if we're going to those are going to be upheld, that we're going to continue to adequately and equitably fund our public schools, there would have been a hell of a problem had that gone on the ballot and passed. You think they're crying about the rainy day fund being and the state general fund being drained in a couple, 3 years now? Believe me, it would have accelerated had that thing gone on the ballot. One final huge problem, and it's to Tom Sawyer's credit, this was brought up on the House floor. As I mentioned, you suppress values, it drives up levies. Car taxes are property taxes on our cars, but they're done under a separate formula and have been since the early 1980s. The formula uses the countywide average levy. You think people are mad about property taxes on their houses? The only thing I've ever seen people matter about are property taxes on their cars. Guess what would have to happen to the property taxes on every car in the state had that thing the Senate passed gone on the ballot? 27% average increase in your car property taxes had that passed.
Well, Chris, I'll play devil's advocate and pretend we're in a classroom for a moment. Is the question that we should be asking ourselves whether or not how do we fix property taxes, but should we be trying to fix the tax formula, period? Is this model of relying on property taxes to support these government services viable anymore? Or should we be looking at trying to revamp the system? To your point, and I know it's more than 4,000 entities now, but many other states have had this same conversation where they've looked at it and gone, oh my God, the amount of tax levies that we have to work through to support the municipalities and everything that people expect is not viable under this model. Should we be looking at a much larger conversation of, does this just simply not work anymore?
Well, it's certainly antiquated, but I will say this for it. Ronald Reagan did not invent trickle-down federalism. Okay, Kansans have always sort of believed that the government closest to the people is better, right? You're going to get a better shake or a more reasonable response if your city council person is your brother-in-law or your neighbor down the street than you are from your legislator in Topeka or your congressperson in Washington, right? The governing level. So Kansans have always had this belief that local control and that's sort of ingrained, I think, into our political zeitgeist. I do think a more holistic approach, if lawmakers from Topeka want to help local units and not micromanage them, as seems to be the new direction that comes out of the Senate in particular, right? We're smarter than you guys, so we're going to put budget lids and all these other restrictions on you, and blah, we don't care that you're elected too, and all the rest of it. And I'm speaking as someone who used to serve on a city council. I think a more holistic approach is necessary. One bill that has thus far been left on the cutting room floor, and unlike Stephanie, bill numbers are like changing socks anymore. I lose track of them. But Adam Smith, to his credit, the chair of the tax committee, was pushing a bill that would have restored a form of revenue sharing from the state to help cities and counties and other entities hold their levies down. The Speaker of the House, rather famously last year, repealed that formula altogether, even though it hadn't been funded in some years. He got tired of hearing about it, and he championed striking those formulas from the statute books altogether. So his own tax chair this year started with a new formula that would have replaced at least a portion of the old money. That did not pass. And to your point about local units, another idea that no one has tried this session or in a number of years, cities and counties, the lobbyists for the League of Municipalities and the Association of Counties used to come in every year to the legislature back in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, and they'd say, look, we get it. We know the public hates property taxes. and thank you for all the sales tax authority that the legislature has given us. And most local sales tax elections do pass because the public views even higher sales taxes as a better alternative to higher property taxes. But local sales taxes are getting pretty darn high in this state, as we all well know. So locals used to come in and say, give us other arrows in our quiver. Let us ask the public, our constituents, what else we can do as an alternative to property taxes, right? We don't have local option income or earnings taxes like you do at the state. We don't have local cigarette or liquor taxes or motor fuels taxes. Locals used to come in every year and ask for all those bills. And of course, they'd never get out of committee. And then after a few years, they wouldn't even get hearings. And so, 10 years ago, the locals even quit introducing them. But if I'm not running the league or the Association of Counties, but if I were, I'd introduce those bills and say, look, let us have a mandatory election and ask the public if we want to put on a local liquor tax here and earmark it for dialing down our mill levy, why shouldn't we be able to do that? So that would also be part of a more holistic approach. And Stephanie mentioned that the $1.5 million is all that really has been provided in property tax relief so far. By the way, it doesn't even kick in 2025. If I read that bill right, it happens in 2026. So tax bills you get this coming November, payable in December, that won't even be affected. So it's a year and a half from now. And if you have a $300,000 house, you're going to get a whopping $51.75 annual tax cut, or a tax cut of $4.31 a month by repealing the $1.5 million currently earmarked for state building funds.
Oh, well, and going back to Stephanie, you mentioned just keeping track of these bills can become a nightmare. So how much do you find yourself, how do you keep your constituents? And I've always admired your constituency work. It's been one of the hallmarks of the way you represent your district. But how much of a challenge is it when they're asking you about property taxes to keep them informed about what's even moving through the legislature with the way they're playing games with these bills?
Well, I think a lot of it is, frankly, working with our staff. We have excellent legislative research staff and excellent reviser of statutes to work with. Actually, Chris used to be, one of our legislative research staffers, and was and still is an excellent resource. When it comes to communicating this with constituents, again, it's kind of sad that I would be considered the hallmark. This is, again, I don't care if I sound like a goody-goody or a purist. I work for the people that I represent, and it is my job to tell them what I'm voting on, and if I'm dissenting with the majority, why I'm doing that. It's a little bit harder to sort of tell people what is still out there. So, for instance, there is a huge conference committee report, and a conference committee report is essentially a negotiated bill between the House chair, vice chair, and ranking minority member, usually on tax, at least if we're talking about taxes, and the chair, vice chair, and ranking minority member on Senate tax. The three of them sit down, hash it out, and determine what the conference committee report or unamendable bill, basically, that the legislators vote on will be. So right now we have a huge one that is called House Bill 2125, and that contains one of the provisions that Chris mentioned earlier. So this is, again, it requires that if there are any property tax increases, it goes to an election requirement. Initially, it was a protest petition, but some of our very small municipalities were understandably upset by that. So an election is expensive at the county level, but you sort of have like that trigger if our local governments exceed certain amounts when it comes to their mills. And then it creates what Chris mentioned earlier, which is the Astra Fund, which is similar to the old repealed local ad valorem tax fund. And so basically that would, yeah, I think it starts at around 60 million and gives them annual transfers from the state general fund. So you get a little bit of help from the state general fund. So the way that our tax chair, and his name, again, his name is Adam Smith, he couldn't be further away from me geographically. He is so far to the west that he is in one of those time zones that is actually in the mountain time zone. So, whereas I'm like practically in Missouri over here. So, but we do get along, and he has served on local governments before. He's a former county commissioner and is a pretty calm and level-headed guy. So, this is one of the plans that he came up with and that we certainly prefer to support at the House level as opposed to the Senate level. And I know that I dunk on senators a lot, but again, they only have to run once every 4 years. And so they're always hilarious and adorable in election years. It's like, oh, do you have to be accountable to the people? That's cute. We do it all the time. So they lose their minds once every 4 years and then mess with us in the House for the other three. But, oh, I see your dog. That's so cute.
Yeah.
Sorry. But huge fan, obviously. But in any case, so we still have a couple of things that are floating around out there that we'll sort of see if that comes through. And again, I think a lot of our local governments are not totally in love with that potential trigger. And I think the way that our tax chair described it was a little bit of carrot, a little bit of stick. And so it's difficult, but it sort of threads the needle between the demands that you have on some people on the far right who want us to put in a cap or a tax lid or really draconian measures on our local government that's disrespectful. And then our local governments, which, frankly, and I can't blame them, don't want us messing with them at all. So if we bring back that state funding that we used to give to them and say, hey, if you guys, get up to this point, at least let it go to a vote of the people. That seems to be what is on the table right now. It remains to be seen, though, if we'll even get a vote on it when we reconvene on Thursday.
Well, and as you mentioned the differences between the House and the Senate, one thing I was curious about, the last 2 years, there's been, in the midst of all the other legislation and policies that have been discussed, there's been an amazing level of bipartisanship on budget tax issues from the House side, where we've seen votes that have almost been unanimous.
We
And
have had unanimous votes on tax policy, which is very unusual. I'd love to tell you why,
what,
though.
well, and that's what I'm curious about. What's happening in the conversations in the House that has led to that level of understanding where all the legislators can get together and go, well, hey, we're all going to say yes to this.
Doing our jobs. And I realize that that sounds overly simplistic, but here's the thing is that, we are elected, number one, to represent our constituencies. And so, I think it's funny because a lot of people in Topeka, and probably rightfully so, can't stand me, but that doesn't matter. I am here to bring what my constituents want and, a little bit of our Eastern Johnson County flavor to Topeka and do our thing, right? But another part of my job is, number one, we represent our constituents, but number two, we figure out a way to work with other people to get our constituents the results that they ask for. And so the reason why we have more unity in the House, which is funny, it's a larger body, it's 125 people, Senate is only 40, but part of the reason is that we start from a good place, and that is in the leadership of our tax committee. So we have an excellent relationship between our chair and our amazing ranking minority leader, our ranking minority member on tax. His name is Tom Sawyer. He has been in the legislature for a number of years, and he represents part of Sedgwick County. And you've got good representation on the tax committee. And again, a lot of people say, oh, tax committee, it's so boring. It is absolutely fascinating because, again, you get people from all over the state coming together and understanding that we need to sometimes compromise a little bit, so that can be uncomfortable. But you have those excellent bipartisan relationships between our chair and our ranking member, and then that goes to our Speaker of the House, who immensely respects our ranking minority member, and that's huge too. We talk a lot about emotional labor when we're talking about things at home, well, if you really want to get it done at the state level, you are doing that emotional labor, and that is working on relationships. And so you've got a lot of people in both minority and majority leadership in the House that have been working on relationships for years, trying to resolve past hurts and, and making sure that we are treating each other with respect, even though I'm sure the speaker probably wants to, like choke me. Sometimes I feel the same way about him, whatever. But eventually, when it comes down to it, we can figure out a way to make things work. So I know that we're hearing a lot about things at the DC level where there is a lot of infighting, and I will fight all day on social issues because, a lot of the people in Topeka are just dead wrong on that. But when it comes to my constituents' money, I'm not messing around. I will figure out a way to make it so that they can save money because there's nothing more personal than your personal budget.
Well, and it's interesting you bring up the situation in DC because before we started, we were having a small conversation, and I'll make Chris laugh here. The old Rumsfeld quote: "You have the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns." Right now in Kansas, we know that we have a problem with property taxes, but we also have the fact that we don't know what the heck's going to come out of DC, and it can have dramatic impacts on Kansas, and in many ways already has. And then we have variables that are completely outside of our control. We don't know if we're going to have a good growing season or are we going to face a drought. We don't know if we are going to face any natural disasters. We don't know what's going on right now. The governor has Western Kansas in a wildfire warning. There are things that are completely outside of our understanding and control right now. How much is that level of chaos impacting these conversations about what do we do on something as normal business as trying to work out a tax bill?
Well, I think to a very large degree, a session can be very immersive. So, for instance, we start our session statutorily every year, the second Monday in January, and it normally goes about 12, 13 weeks. Again, this is a very short session, which has, everyone, advocates, lobbyists, staff, legislators, all running at this breakneck speed. So this has been a very difficult session because we are all trying to get things done and we're all under a tremendous amount of stress. Not sure why the session needs to be that short, but I don't make that decision. I just work within the constructs of the reality up there. And so it is very immersive. So oftentimes I will be so immersed in Kansas related things, and I get so immersed in tax, I'm not on the appropriations committee or on any budget subcommittees. So if I'm not talking to my colleagues who are on the appropriations team, then sometimes the tax team will be doing things and, uh-oh, wait a minute. How is this going to affect the budget? Sometimes we get tax and appropriations policies that come through other committees. And so that constant communication and emotional labor is important. But then keep in mind that if I am tunnel vision on Kansas tax policy, how much am I able to pay attention to what's happening at the federal level? Very little. It's sometimes we get so embroiled in what's going on and doing our jobs that, DC could have blown up and I wouldn't know it because I would be so focused on doing my job as a state legislator. And that's where some of the peril comes in. But conversely, here's the other thing we need to keep in mind is that if we are worrying so much about, oh no, what's going to happen at the federal level, then that ends up kind of putting us in a functional freeze and sort of complying in advance. Because a lot of the stuff that is happening in DC isn't really happening. A lot of that is just smoke and mirrors and shock and awe, executive orders that are getting overturned by the courts or that, need congressional action to really put teeth into them or that are going to expire. And so a lot of it is that while I'm cognizant and my colleagues are of what's going on at the DC level, we still have our job to do. And so, sorry, my dog. And so we just continue doing our very best to make sure that we're, focusing on Kansas and doing Kansas things that need to be done. And then we'll deal with the fallout from DC as it comes, if it comes.
Well, and to that point, Chris,
Yeah, I
like as Stephanie said, DC can blow up. It kind of did today. like on from a tax economic policy, I don't even want to look at what the stock market did at the end of the day right now. But in your seat as from an economist perspective, what do you see is happening?
Well, and this is something I grappled with for many years when I was on sort of the revenue estimating group. And certainly this kind of chaos isn't good. I will say the legislature as a whole and policymakers in general in Kansas are a little bit more inoculated from dramatic national or international events having an immediate direct impact than they were 8-10 years ago, because there is a nice cushion built up in the state general fund ending balance and in sort of the rainy day fund that we did not used to have a decade ago, when we were many hundreds of millions of dollars in the red ink during the failed Brownback tax experiment. Anything that happened in DC that made that worse was a hell of a headache, because we were in a hole that we were digging. The other point I'd make is, it seems to me that the legislature as an institution is just acting as on the results of the 2024 election, right? The people, oh, okay, we now have this sort of veto-proof supermajority now, and so the legislature is doing things. They don't care what's happening in Washington. They're passing bills to strip the governor's power, right? There's, whether it be to replace statewide office holders that resign, or her ability to veto a budget and have it default to the previous year's budget if nothing else can be passed. They're just sort of stripping powers, it seems to me, across the board. And then some of the special interest groups that have been pushing these hobby horse bills for a number of years are beginning to get them across the finish line. It isn't just the election of judges thing. Let me give you an example from tax that directly impacts the ability of lawmakers to provide property tax relief, right? We've talked a lot tonight about how both parties in the last election were, people were upset about property taxes, right? And only thus far, only minimal relief has really been provided. But there's a bill that is sitting on the governor's desk, and it got 30 votes in the Senate and 84 in the House. I think it's Senate Bill 269. I think I do have the number of that one. It's this dopey formulaic bill that if income tax receipts grow more than the rate of inflation, and they almost always do, there's this automatic rollback that happens in the fall in the upcoming year's income tax rates, okay? Now, think about the whole basket of state general fund receipts. You're often going to get income tax receipts growing faster than the rate of inflation. Sales tax, some years yes, some years no. And then you've got the liquor and cigarette and severance taxes that almost never grow at all. Some of them are even declining. So the whole basket of state general fund taxes, even if income taxes are growing at 6, 7, 8%, the whole basket of state general fund taxes might only be growing 3.5%, somewhere around, what can be an average annual rate of inflation. And if the cost of providing desk chairs and paper clips, forget about health insurance for state employees, if that's going up about the rate of inflation, you're not really spending any new money, right? Forget about fully funding special ed or expanding Medicaid or anything else anybody might want to do with the money. But let's talk about something somebody might want to do with the money. Let's say income taxes as measured June 30th at the end of the state's fiscal year come in 7, 8% above where they were a year earlier, okay? That money, Stephanie might be sitting there right now saying, oh, okay, well, that dragged the overall general fund receipts to 3.5 or 4%. Maybe that's a sustainable level. But boy, if we got a little extra jolt of income tax money, that's on the table. When I get back to town next January, I can now provide property tax cuts for that. I can go in, I could dial down the 20 mils public school levy to 18 mils or something. We could have that conversation about how to finance actual legitimate property tax relief. If the governor vetoes the bill, as I suspect she might on 269, and that veto is overridden, as I suspect it will be since it got 84 and 30 votes, Stephanie won't have that ability. When she comes back to town every year in January now, there will have been mandated income tax rate cuts, by the way, in the upper bracket. We've got to make sure we dial down the bracket for the wealthiest among us, right? This is a hobby horse that the Kansas Chamber and the Koch-funded AstroTurf groups have been pushing for years, and they got it through this year. The income tax rates will have been dialed down, okay? So that money, an equivalent amount of money from the largesse that came in growth over the income tax in the previous year will have already been returned to taxpayers. And if Stephanie or anybody wanted to introduce a bill and say, oh, no, let's stop now. We don't want to have this automatically happen where anytime we can afford tax cuts, it's only going to go to the upper bracket individual income taxpayers. Let's help all of our constituents who want property tax cuts. If she introduced a bill to take back some of that money, she's going to get postcarded at the next election because she'll be trying to undo the formula that provided automatic income tax cuts. So the whole thing is this rigged craps game on autopilot that it's just horrible public policy, right?
Because people don't see how inequitable that is, because all they hear is, oh, tax break, yay. But they don't realize that's not for you. That's for the Koch
most
brothers.
certainly not.
Well, and going with the idea that people are trying gimmicks now, and we're seeing more gimmicks. One of the gimmicks I keep hearing on this issue is, and Stephanie, you alluded to it earlier, well, the problem is we just need more housing. Let's just build more housing. And that sounds really nice, but I feel like it's an empty talking point when people think that we can build our way out of this property tax problem by somehow creating more affordable housing that will expand the tax base and make it easier for people to own a home, but yet not increase the need for budgeted government services.
And I still support more affordable housing. So for instance, there still is on the table a potential repeal of the low-income housing tax credit. And I strongly oppose that repeal because I do think, we are dealing with a housing shortage. We're dealing with a workforce shortage as well. This is something that Kansas desperately needs from an economic standpoint. Will more housing necessarily lower property taxes? I have my doubts, honestly. But does that mean that we don't need it? Also, no.
No.
We do.
Well, and I'll carry some water for myself and a lot of younger friends. The conversation that I hear more and more is that the idea of that American dream, go to college, get a good job, get a house, you'll be able to have kids and have a decent middle class life. More and more people don't believe in it anymore because housing is not affordable. And they feel like they can't get access to that, or they feel like they have to move and pick their life up to go find it. And this is especially true in Western Kansas, where we have many people who are like, I can't find affordable housing in my community. So we end up seeing people move out of state, seeking jobs and better opportunity.
You can't get teachers, you can't get anyone to work at your local hospital because there's no place for them to live.
And so some of that, tends to be, a little bit of a wage problem or an income problem, because if you want to have, teachers and state workers to provide these services, then you need to make sure that you are providing them with a competitive income that will allow them to live in the area in which they serve. And so, again, that's an age-old problem. I remember during the World Series earthquake, God, that was like in 93. One of the big problems was that where it was the worst in San Francisco, most of the first responders lived in Oakland because they couldn't afford to live where a lot of the disaster was. So this is a problem that we experience across the entire country. Another issue that we run into, I will often hear people say, well, what about tax reduction for seniors? And so some of that, yes, I represent a lot of seniors, and it is difficult when you've retired, when you're on a fixed income, maybe you've paid off your house, but then your property taxes come in and yikes, So again, that sticker shock is real. But then if we're cutting property taxes for seniors, then who's paying for it and where does that go? So that tends to be one of the issues.
Well, and so if, as Betsy noted, we're kind of coming to the end, and this has been an incredibly detailed, but also I really want to say thank you to both of you because you've been able to distill some of these issues into a very clear and remarkably concise discussion for what we're talking about, which is not going to be solved in one conversation. But if there's something that we really could do a better job educating the public about over the next several months before the next session, because we can't introduce any new bills now. We're not going to be able to change what's going to come out of this year's. But what conversations, what issues do we need to spend some more time talking about so that we can build a more informed public when it comes to trying to solve this at the legislative level?
Basically, where property taxes come from as far as taxing entities are concerned, and who you need to talk to about various increases. It's obviously if my constituents talk to me about higher property taxes, I'm going to try and figure out a way to do what the state has a purview over. But maybe, telling folks like, all right, look at the back of your tax form, look at all of these taxing entities. These are some of the folks that you need to talk to. And so I think a lot of it, they just don't realize that it's just, it's easier to one-stop shop and go to your legislators because, I mean, we are amazing, but it's harder to talk to all of, your Board of County Commissioners and your Johnson County Community College folks and your Board of Education, but just more education as to how many taxing entities we have and that property tax does get you the things that you like to have. And but also, it still is a very real reality. We need to give them that information along with sympathy and kindness because people do not like being spoken down to and told the way that it is. And, you should be grateful because those are your services. Well, you know what? Maybe someone who can't use a park isn't really wild about paying for that. Maybe someone that can't have children isn't nuts about paying for schools. And so sympathy and respect needs to be the lens with which we deliver this information to our constituents. Because if we're getting an attitude with them or acting like we're smarter than them, we're dead in the water and we deserve to be dead in the water if that's the way we talk to our constituents. So respect,
That is
bottom
very,
line.
very well said. Very well said. And Chris, you and I have talked about this so many times. I feel like, you know, we could fill a book with the things we've been trying to understand how to better explain. But is there anything that really jumped out at you after this session?
Oh, I just was thinking a little bit more about one of the approaches to property taxes is the circuit breaker that I mentioned earlier. And one of the really unfortunate things that has happened, the legislature has not kept up with the commitment to expanding and providing circuit breakers, right? We have sympathy for the fixed income seniors struggling to pay their prescription drug bills and this kind of stuff. Give them back more money. If we've got money laying around for tax cuts, let's enhance those. And I think that might be one of the things in 21-25 is it enhances this property tax freeze funding pool for seniors that Senator Holland and others worked to get passed a couple years ago. But that's all fine and well and good. But the state has not kept its commitments to expanding these programs. 10 years ago, during the failed Brownback tax experiment, one of the ways they went to fund it, and this really irritates Stephanie, I think more than any other legislators and me among any other staffers, they kicked renters out of the homestead program. Virtually every state that has these circuit breaker programs let renters participate under the assumption that landlords pass property taxes on to renters through leases. But Brownback's people kicked renters out of the program. So it's just about. But the thing that's most appalling to me is 6 or 8 cities over here in Johnson County now, and maybe even the county itself, have started their own little circuit breaker programs because the state hasn't kept up with theirs. If you're in Merriam or Mission or Shawnee or one of the cities over here, hell, my wife and I probably qualify if I look in for it. If you're above a certain age, you can qualify to get your taxes frozen. Okay, locals, as I told you, don't have an income tax. right? And to the extent locals are deciding we're going to freeze seniors' property taxes to the extent the legislature doesn't, guess what's happening? The balloon is getting directly squeezed, and mill levies are going up, and the 28-year-olds who can't afford to buy a house there anyway, it gets that much worse. So it appalls me that locals have had to go out and try and address the issue of fixed income seniors' property taxes on their own ticket. If the legislature felt the responsibility in 1971, when Governor Docking put that in, it should continue to fund that above all other areas of priority, and certainly above upper bracket income tax cuts that are formulaically and brainlessly provided by some magic formula.
Well, and on that note, I think one of the things we'll note from our side at the 802 is that we consider that it is as much our responsibility as constituents and voters and citizens of Kansas to educate ourselves so that we can participate in this process alongside the legislators and policymakers, because it doesn't help anybody if we're lucky enough to have a representative who knocks on their door or shows up for the town hall and is willing to have the conversation, but ends up spending the majority of the time trying to correct a misunderstanding or a lack of knowledge that has led us to being angry or demanding change that isn't possible or isn't based in what's actually going on.
Yeah, isn't really
So,
the state's deal to do.
yep. So to that point, we will continue to work on this issue and highlight that property taxes are a very complex issue that happens at the state and the local municipality level, and that there's going to have to be ongoing efforts to address it from both sides of that equation.
I
So
feel
I want to
another
say thank
learning
you.
module coming on, because we've got health access, we've got public education, we've got common sense gun ownership as learning modules on our website. I feel like a tax policy learning module needs to happen.
And Representative Sawyer Clayton, I want to say thank you, because I do check your social media when you're in session and bills are voting, because I look and see, okay, what's going on, because you can't always stay on top of the YouTube feed to know, but I can go in and I can see, okay, here's the bills and here's what happened and here's how it went down. And I know that level of transparency is something that I wish I saw from a lot more people, but it is a huge help to us from our side to be able to understand what's going on from that granular level. So thank you so much for everything you do. And Chris, thank you for all the insight and experience and understanding you bring to the economic and policy conversation. Really appreciate the two of you making time tonight.
Happy to do it. Thank you for having me.
Our
Thanks for having
pleasure.
me.
You want to cut us off, Julie?